Welcome back to our third and last video on Charlemagne. In the first two videos, we covered the rise of the Carolingians to power. We talked about how the first dynasty of Frankish kings, the Merovingians, that's the dynasty of Clovis, had 300 decent years. But gradually, the Merovingian dynasty, the first kings of France really, lost power. They lost power because they stopped fighting, and as they stopped fighting, people stopped following them. In their place came the Carolingians. The Carolingians began as mayors of the palace, the second in command. When the old king is getting weak, the best person to be can be the second in command. And the Carolingians gradually gained power. They started fighting, which meant they were able to get loot and respect and reward followers. Finally, they decide we've had enough being second in command. We want to actually rule also. The Carolingian dynasty is named after the greatest of their kings, Carolus Magnus, who we call Charlemagne or Charles the Great. Charles the Great called himself the Holy Roman Emperor. So he was a great Germanic warrior, but he was a great Germanic warrior who was a Christian and wanted to be a Roman emperor. So you saw those three cultures, German, Christian, Roman, mixing together to form a new medieval culture. Now, Charlemagne's time of rule, this is a short golden age. So one of the things you know from history is that when there's a golden age, there's a crash. Well, this is a golden age. It's a short golden age. And obviously, it's not perfect for everybody. But still, from the year 800 to 850, these are decent years for Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. And this is actually important because it used to be that we called the whole time period from 500, right after Rome fell, all the way until the Renaissance, the Dark Ages. 1,000 years of darkness. This was a whole dark age. And the idea is there's nothing good in the Middle Ages, nothing light, nothing positive. It was all dark and violent and backward and ignorant and superstitious and bad and violent. Well, we've started to say in the last 20, 30 years, actually even earlier, that, okay, this is wrong. Clearly, there are golden ages, there are good times in the dark ages. And one of these was actually the time of Charlemagne. And actually, some people have said it's so good, they've even called this time the Carolingian Renaissance. Think about that. We normally think about the Renaissance, we think about Italy in 1500, the time of Romeo and Juliet, and Shakespeare, the time of art and architecture and the humanities. Well, yes, that was a Renaissance. That was really important, but it wasn't the only one. So there was another Renaissance, a short one, but a real Renaissance from the year 800 to 850 under the time of Charlemagne. This was called the Carolingian Renaissance, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the Carolingian Renaissance happens because Charlemagne himself was interested in not just being a German warrior. Think about someone like Beowulf. Someone like Beowulf has no interest in, or even Clovis really, has no interest in learning or knowledge or art or architecture. That's not their personalities. They're German warriors. They want glory and loot and battle and fame. Charlemagne was that, but he was also a Christian who wanted to be a Roman emperor. And as a Christian and a Roman emperor, he had interest in learning and art and architecture. Because emperors, because kings, one of the things great leaders do is they build stuff. Charlemagne set out to build stuff. He can do this for a few reasons. All his fighting made him rich. And because he's rich, he has a lot of money to spend on building. Good system. Also, he wants to be a Roman emperor. He is really sincere in wanting to be what he thinks a good Roman emperor should be. And he knew, because they had the ruins of Rome, they had the marble left behind, he knew that good Roman emperors built great buildings. And so one of the first things Charlemagne does, for the Carolingian Renaissance, he undertakes a building program. You know this going back to Egypt and before. Great leaders like to build. But it has a Christian spin because he doesn't build a pyramid or a pagan temple to a pagan god. He builds a church. The great chapel and cathedral at Aachen. Now, Aachen is in Germany today. It's his capital city, and he thinks that his capital city needs a really good church. So he builds this enormous chapel. Actually, if you look at it, it has some similarities not only to what becomes later Gothic art, but also to Byzantine art. It's got all the points, like not rounded stuff, but you see it does have a main dome in the center. And so Charlemagne was interested in copying the Byzantines also because he said the Byzantines are good Roman emperors. So all of this is about Charlemagne carrying on a building program. So he wants to be a good Roman emperor, he builds. But he's also a Christian, so what does he build? He builds a great church. Interesting setup. And so this church at Aachen, in some ways it's similar to Byzantine art, but it's also similar, it foreshadows the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages. That's why the thing I said about Charlemagne is, he is an example of Roman, German, and Christian culture mixing and becoming the basis of what we will think of as the culture of the Middle Ages. So that's the first thing he does. The first thing he does as part of his Renaissance is a building program. Second thing he does, he tries to revive learning. That's not a very Germanic thing to do, but it is a Christian and a Roman thing to do. It's a Christian thing to do because who was it who saved learning? Well, it was the Irish and Christian monks who copied books, who established monastic libraries, who kept learning and knowledge from being lost in the Dark Ages. It's also a Roman thing to do. Romans also had philosophy and education. So this is Charlemagne being a good Roman and a good Christian. So with all of his money, he can build stuff, but he can do something else. He can hire teachers. Great man wanting to hire teachers, right? So with all of his money, Charlemagne attracts scholars, teachers to his courts. He pays copyists, he pays people to copy manuscripts, to build libraries so material won't be lost. They even invent a new kind of handwriting. If you look at the handwriting here, over on the left of the screen, this is a very classic Roman style of handwriting. Look at the big block letters, everything's capital. It's very neat, it's very easy to read, but it has one downside. It's really slow to write. So if you're trying to copy a bunch of books as fast as you can, that's a terrible handwriting to use. You want to use something more like what we would call lowercase letters, right? Or minuscule for small letters. And so they actually invent at the court of Charlemagne a new style of handwriting. And this new style of handwriting is what we would call a lowercase style. It's not as neat, it's not as clean, but it's like your notebooks, right? I mean, you don't write in all nice, super neat caps when you're taking notes. You write in a quick handwriting that you can hopefully read later, but it lets them copy books faster, which lets them save more learning from being lost. And this is one of the things Charlemagne wants to do. He wants to save this learning from being lost. And so the court of Charlemagne, you see, before it was only monasteries that were centers of learning, those religious men living together. Think about the monk writing his Pangur Ban, My Cat poem. Before, they were the only places saving knowledge. Now, Charlemagne and his court are saving knowledge and actually doing it even more because the monks would copy books kind of in their spare time. Charlemagne's paying people to do this full time. He brings in famous teachers. He brings in teachers to teach the royal family. Charlemagne himself wants to be educated. He has his children, his sons and his daughters too, educated because it's important to him to preserve this learning. And these teachers are there also to give Charlemagne advice. to tell him the way Roman emperors used to do things, because remember, he wants to be a Roman emperor. Charlemagne makes another step. He orders every monastery in his kingdom to teach anyone, noble, commoner, any peasant could go to a monastery and get an education. That's a really big step. It's, in a sense, it's almost an attempt to make education universal. That doesn't actually happen, because obviously, if you're a peasant just trying to get enough to live, your family's not going to send you to a monastery to study. One, they need you to work the fields. Two, what good is all that knowledge, right? That's why parents don't want their kids to major in history. What are you going to do, live in a cardboard box? So, no one actually, it's not like everyone actually becomes educated, but just to have that available as an opportunity was a really big step for Charlemagne to take. And he does this despite the fact that nobles were complaining about it. You can't educate the peasants, they'll get too uppity, bad, no, don't do that. But Charlemagne really believed in the importance of this education. Now, the Merovingian rulers, someone like Clovis, had no interest in art and architecture. They didn't want to build great buildings. Why? Because they were German warriors. And that's really all they were. By the time you get to Charlemagne, he's not just a German warrior. He's a Christian, and he wants to be a Roman. He sees himself as trying to bring back the fallen Roman Empire. He is the Holy Roman Emperor, and he wants to do the things a good Roman emperor did. The work of Charlemagne, of his court, some of it's quite incredible, because those manuscripts, they don't just take notes on them, they make beautiful drawings in them, like the monks did, like the Book of Kells. Like, this is some of the greatest painting and art of this time period. It's incredibly intricate. The patterns are really careful. The colors are amazing. They learned from the Irish monks, and they try to improve on it. Those manuscript illuminations could be insanely elaborate and decorative. Like, this was really a labor of love for a lot of these scholars. They genuinely love, you would have to genuinely love what you're doing to do something like this. So to sum up, Charlemagne himself is a perfect example of this mix of three cultures, of Roman culture, because he calls himself the Holy Roman Emperor. He tries to do careful, organized government. He has a Renaissance to support education and building. So he's a Roman. He's also a German, because he fights. It really is still important to him to be a great warrior, to win loot in battle. But he doesn't just use the loot to reward his followers. He uses the loot to build for his building program, for his education program. And he's a Christian, he's a sincere Christian. He supports the Pope, he's building churches. So Charlemagne is a fascinating figure. On one hand, he's trying to be a Roman. He's trying to be a Roman, but he's not really. What he really is a German Christian trying to copy Rome, who is himself setting the stage for a new medieval culture. And it's that culture we're going to look at in the coming weeks.